What a nice, I hesitate to use the word crowd, but it's a nice gathering. Hello. It's themselves. So this talk is actually being sponsored by Phil and Sue Lewis in memory of their good friend, the late Johnny Baker, who was obviously dedicated extremely to the advancement of Jewish culture and learning. And the topic we're going to do tonight is a bit of an extreme one. I had not given it for quite some years, and then I gave it about 2.5 weeks ago in New Jersey for the first time to the Syrian Jewish community. And that caused me to have to kind of do a little bit of a rethink about how I wanted to present this material. The person organising that said, David, I want you to give exactly the same talk I saw on YouTube, because I've watched that 15 times, and I want my friends to do exactly that talk. So I gave exactly that talk, but I'm actually thinking that I'm going to revise slightly the way we do it. The topic that I've been asked to talk about tonight, which is part of like a bit of a series of frameworks, is the whole of Jewish philosophy, or Jewish philosophy in 1 hour. I'm just going to carry this off, and I'm going to use the back of that chair since people are obviously too frightened to sit there. So in the event that happens, I can always sit there myself and watch the talk. Why that's a little frightening is because Jewish philosophy is a complex topic. We're going to try and break it down, and we're not only going to try and make it a little bit interesting, we're going to try and make it a little bit relevant. But it wouldn't necessarily be my first choice as the first topic that I would do in this series of framework talks. Jewish philosophy is something that we tend to come to after we've looked at some other things. Why? Because Jewish philosophy, capital J, capital P, in the sense it is widely understood, is first and foremost a reactive project. It's a reactive project. What do I mean by that? I mean this. Philosophy, without the Jewish, just philosophy as an exercise, is not particularly Jewish activity. We didn't invent it, we didn't come up with it, but we are forced throughout history to react to it. And hopefully over the course of this talk, that observation will become evident. Who did start this project of philosophy? And let's look for a second at what philosophy actually is, because many of us in this room might have a different concept of what philosophy means. We all know that every taxi driver you meet has a philosophy. But what do we actually mean when we use that term in a formal sense? So here's how I'm going to use it, and how it is used by philosophers. It is an attempt to understand things, whether that is the world, reality, ourselves, through the use of this extraordinarily exciting and amazing instrument inside our heads called our mind. It is the attempt to understand the world through rational and logical processes that are fundamentally derived from the human mind and its ability to make logical and sensible and rational thoughts. And what picture of reality can we build up from that? Now, when I say it's rational, the reason that it's not a particularly Jewish activity is not because Jews do not have rational thoughts. Sometimes we do. Sometimes. Not on shul boards and committees, but sometimes individually we do have rational thoughts. But our main mode as a people and as a cultural continuum in the world has stationed its existence on a different kind of premise. That premise being one of revelation. We believe that the divine and the divine purpose for us was revealed to the Jewish people, not just for us, but for humanity. All logical and rational thoughts that we might put on top of that are all very nice, but it doesn't really inform our being as Jews in the world. And so we can have rational thoughts, but they are not really considered of their own specifically Jewish rational thoughts. where Jewish philosophy comes into play is the very, very interesting fact that the people that are having rational thoughts often throw up challenges to the Jewish world to which we have to respond. I'm going to talk in the next little while about some problems mentally and culturally that people have had in the past that you might think, why on earth would that even be a problem? But they were as much a problem for them as the major intellectual challenges for us today. Are we settled? And one for yourself. All right. Well, let's get underway because I said it's Jewish philosophy in an hour, and I want to get it done in an hour, and I want us to be able to transmit this framework so we can see exactly where we are. If it wasn't us who came up with philosophy, who was it? Who started that whole project? It was, in fact, our friends, the Greeks. And it started pretty much quite some time before the Common Era, 7 or 8 centuries before the Common Era, when the Greeks were still, shepherds basically, and hanging out and fondling goats and doing what they do. And then, at some point, they started to think about reality and to think about rational ideas. One of the most famous of the early ideas has often been referred to, by the way, anybody who has studied philosophy formally, very, very good. So obviously I might be saying some ideas that might seem simple, and if everything I say is simple, please tell me, we'll up the level. But if it's too high that we can't even see the numbers, we can bring it down a little. I need your reaction. No point sitting here going, oh, I have no idea what he was talking about. But, the most famous of those early philosophical problems is a problem called Zeno's paradox, right? The dude called Zeno is sitting in his field and he goes, if I walk halfway across the field, I get to halfway, and then I walk halfway again between where I am and the end of the field, and I walk halfway again after that, and halfway again, will I ever get to the end of the field? That kind of thing. But of course, Greek thought developed quite seriously until it was producing some impressive intellectual products, not only in terms of mathematics and fundamental logic, but in terms of really trying to understand the essence of what's happening in the world. What really obsessed the Greeks was this notion of change. Why do things change? And why are there different things in the world? Surely everything should be the same. Why are things different? So that then allows them to come up with some amazingly clever answers, which in fact even from today's standards look kind of correct, even if it's without all of the mathematical and physics that we understand are behind those answers, such as atomic theory and so on. But they were obsessed with trying to find out whether or not there was indeed one fundamental substance to everything. Carlus's famous idea of fire, others had ideas of water, until we get to a guy called Heraclitus, who says that in fact the only thing that actually exists is change itself. And then you get people like Parmenides, and he's going, everything is actually one. And okay, Parmenides, what do you mean by that? How come I can see different things? That's the riddle of creation. I'm going to leave you to think about that. And in fact, once we get to the golden age of Greek philosophy, then we are starting to answer and speculate upon what answers to those kinds of questions might look like. Now, that's a tremendously ridiculous summary of Greek thought, but we don't have too much time to spend on the Greeks. What we need to understand is the two big twin pillars that emerge from the classical world that definitely go on to influence everyone, including us. And those two, of course, are Plato and Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle not only are the giants of Greek thought, and Plato and Aristotle are living round about the 4th century BCE, and don't forget that Aristotle was Alexander the Great's teacher, so when Alexander conquered us, that was our head-on encounter with Hellenism and the new Greek ideology coming into the world, Plato and Aristotle are two different ways of looking at reality using rational processes. Although each of them has many intricate aspects to their thought, particularly Aristotle, who comes up with all sorts of ideas and rules for logic and so on that went on to become incredibly influential even till today. We can summarize Plato and Aristotle, and I have to, I don't want to, I mean I do, but I have to, because they are so influential on everyone going forward. And so I'm going to give a little summary of Plato and Aristotle and how they differ. Plato, at the end of the day, is asking us to make a mental movement away from this corrupt, multitudinous reality. The famous analogy that Plato gives of people sitting in a cave, his famous analogy in the Republic, we're all sitting in a cave, and what we're really seeing all around us are just the flickering of shadows on the wall from some fire. What he really wants us to do is stand up, walk out of the cave, and have a look at the true reality that is going on. And what is going on is what he refers to as a realm of ideal forms. There is a perfect realm of ideal forms. Everything that we see is only a corrupt reflection or derivation of those ideal forms. At the top of this hierarchy of ideal forms for Plato, and this is why Platonic theory became so exciting later on for people that were trying to combine Greek religion with revealed monotheistic religions, is at the top of this great big pyramid of the realm of ideal forms is Plato's concept of the good. And everything emerges from that. Aristotle, on the other hand, wants us to make a mental movement into reality. He doesn't need us to stand up and break our chains and move out of the cave. He wants us to look around us and explore and understand the reality in which we find ourselves, and primarily, by understanding that, to catalogue and to categorize that reality and to understand its functional workings. The whole project of taxonomy and systematization will, says Aristotle, ultimately reveal to us the universal forms, because there is no other reality. This is the one that we have to look at. And that is why Aristotle goes on, in a sense, to become kind of what's going to become the cornerstone of Western science. But these two have an influence thousands of years beyond their actual teachings and the lives in which they were embedded. But none of this is really concerning Jewish people. We're kind of busy doing other things. These guys are living halfway through the Second Temple period. We have a Second Temple to run, and we have various survival issues I don't need to remind you of, and then the temple gets destroyed, and then we have exile issues we have to wonder about. Not only that, but we have our own creative intellectual projects. We're developing an entire systematization and transmission of the oral law. We're creating a Talmud, 2 Talmuds in fact, entire genres of wisdom literature, an entire genre of literature called Midrash, of exegetical literature. Several world religions are emerging from us. We're fighting Gnosticism, we're fighting Manichaeism, we're fighting Zoroastrianism, we're fighting Christianity, we're fighting Islam. We're busy. We're busy. You ain't got time to think about Plato and Aristotle. There is, however, one Jewish thinker deep inside that whole period that is of importance to us, because it's importance to world religions, and he's a Jewish person who is actually also a philosopher in the Platonic mode of thought. And that is generally someone who is regarded as the first Jewish philosopher. Not so much because he is taking the challenges of rational thinking and trying to work out how he can ameliorate that with Judaism, although he is, but because he is so steeped in understanding the Greek way of thought, and because he is ecstatic about the Bible, and because he's a Jew, he wants to try and fix various problems that we would have if we were to be a Platonic philosopher and at the same time believe in the revealed Torah. Because a big problem that Platonic philosophers had was this idea of dualism. It's all very well to say, here's this world here, and there's that realm of perfect forms, which, okay, we can call that heaven or whatever we want to call it, it's up there. But how do we bridge the two? How do we bridge that gap? How do we get from there to here and from here to there? And this philosopher, who is living in Alexandria in the 1st century, and anybody of us who were in Alexandria in the 1st century could tell you, I wasn't pointing in particular, I'm just saying, if we were there we could tell you, that is kind of like, anyone know anything about Alexandria in the 1st century? Jewish Alexandria? It was the New York of its day. No question. Alexandria was the most cosmopolitan place in the world. Everybody was going through it. And it had a giant, massive Jewish community full of intellectuals and artists and religious figures. And this figure was not only a spiritual leader in his own right, but also a communal leader. And his name was Philo. He's known as Philo of Alexandria. Now, this is not a lecture on Philo, so we've got to keep it short. And when the name Philo comes up at those intellectual dinner parties that you all attend, the one thing you would need to know to look like you are slightly informed would be the one massive contribution that Philo makes.
Pastry.
Brilliant. I believe that's spelled F-I-L-O. But that's classic. Yes. I will use that if no one else says it. Philo, we would be knowing more about Philo if it wasn't for the fact that Philo's contribution went on to become very influential in a different religion. He was in fact trying to solve a problem between Platonic philosophy and Torah. And he came up with this idea that there is an intermediary between the realm of ideal forms that Plato talks about and this reality. And that is Philo's idea of philosophy is already around. Philosophia, the love of wisdom, that's already around. His big idea, when I say it, some of you are going to go, oh. What is it? Oh, close. It is the idea which we call the logos. The logos, which literally means the word. For Philo, the Torah is an embodiment of God. It is the divine incarnate in words, in language, in a reality that is revealed through language and through words and through logical principles which form the Torah. Now, you can see why that was exciting for Christianity, because they went, oh, an intermediary. Get the logos. That's why the book of John starts in Archeologos. Get the logos, the prototheon in the Greek. In the beginning was the word, and the word was God. They used the word logos because they are fully influenced by Philo's idea. That didn't really take off in Judaism. It comes in a little later in Jewish thought as an understanding of the Torah in some mystical strands of Judaism. But it was more influential on Christianity than on us, because at the end of the day, we were not that concerned. We really didn't care to match what we were trying to say with Plato. And Plato's philosophy doesn't stay static. Over the next 1,000 years after Plato, it develops a number of different forms, one of which we call Neoplatonic thought, goes on to become extremely influential, because Neoplatonic thought introduces the idea, Neoplatonic. Anytime you see the word Neoplatonic, you know you're talking about something that introduces a system of emanations from the one to the many, from the pure, the reified, the abstract, the ideal, to the multitudinous, corrupt, differential reality we all live in. A series of emanations. An idea that, strictly speaking, comes back into Jewish mysticism in a big way, ameliorated by certain things. So Our first big contributor is Philo, but Philo's living in the 1st century, and really, at the end of the day, no one's really that excited by it, and no one's excited by Plato and Aristotle in the Jewish intellectual world until much later. Until, in fact, around the 9th and 10th centuries. And so that's really where our story starts. The story that we call capital J, capital P, Jewish philosophy, and it starts more or less in the 9th and 10th centuries. And what happened in the 9th and 10th centuries to cause that project to kick off? What's happening in the world, in the Jewish world, in the 9th and 10th centuries to suddenly make us have to react to intellectual challenges? Remember that for most of Jewish history up to that point, no one had threatened us intellectually. You can kill us, you can throw stones at us, but no one has a more insightful, more wise, more intellectual, more interesting set of ideas to work with and texts to work with than the Jewish people. Thank you, that's nice, but we don't need that here. Until the 9th and 10th centuries. What happened? Crusades? No. The Crusades are not going to start just yet.
Islam?
Well, hold on. Because, as you know, because we all learnt at school, right, there was this thing called the Dark Ages, right? And Europe basically went, the lights got turned off, and all of that learning from the classical period was carried through by mostly the Arab world and the world of Islam. When Islam came along in the 7th century, they had no problem with taking all of the Greeks that they could find and fitting them in to their monotheistic picture of the world. Always remember, Islam of the Middle Ages, certainly of the early Middle Ages, was not the Islamic world we see today. It was an open and inquiring and confident and technologically and philosophically leading world. It was the Christian world that were living in the Bach. And therefore, Islam started to produce some very, very impressive intellectual syntheses between Greek thought and Islamic ideas about revealed Abrahamic religion. And that comes into many, many different schools of Islamic thought, but they all kind of exist under this umbrella that we call today, it's just really a shorthand for this kind of activity within Islam, and it's called the Kalam. And the Kalam had many, many different types of schools of thought as well. And of course, Jews are living right across the Islamic world. And what eventually starts happening in the 9th and 10th centuries is Islamic philosophers are coming to Jews and coming to Jewish thinkers and saying, oh, you have a corporeal God. Allah, that is a completely reified, abstract, unified concept of the divine. But when you open your Bible, your God has eyes, he has ears, he has hands, he has legs, he walks around, he's a dude. How is that compatible with our tremendously reified philosophical idea of an unembodied God that is the only God that makes sense rationally in a monotheistic worldview? These were serious questions. I'm begging you because I'm finding it hard to concentrate. So you have to understand how much I love this man, but I can't. It's just. And as always, when the Jewish people are faced with intellectual challenges, and I know that you and I, as I said earlier, might think, oh, what's the big challenge there? The answers are obvious. They're only obvious because of the solutions that Jewish philosophy found for them. But those types of questions, those types of challenges were as big then as they would be now, the types of questions that people are confronted with when they look at YouTube clips of Hitchens and Dawkins and coming from the contemporary school of atheism or challenging from science. These questions, as we will also see with other questions throughout this journey of Jewish philosophy, were equally challenging. But of course, when we have those challenges, we always have people who can come along and provide the framework for an answer. And that is why, at the first half of the 10th century, in the early 900s, there arose one individual who writes the first systematic book of Jewish philosophy and goes to town on the Kalam and goes to town on Islamic challenges, carefully because he's living in Islamic countries, but explains how Judaism is far more elevated than Islam thinks it is. That figure, who is enormous, and when I talk about him, don't think I'm just talking about, you can imagine in an hour that I don't really have that many people to talk, I've already used up 25 minutes, how significant everyone I talk about is. But this particular figure who sets the whole tenure of Jewish philosophy and its basic tenets is someone that we really need to understand. He was born, there's an argument about whether he was born in 882 or 892. He was born in Egypt in the Fayoum. He, at the age of 25, don't call out. I say that 3 times, there will be people who will call out. You know that. I don't mean that you, I mean, you've sat in my talks before, you know people will call out. You know what I mean? Well, don't call out. Put your hand up if you know who I'm talking about. Excellent. So he's born he's around 25 years old. He realizes that he is kind of the cleverest guy he's ever met. So where do you go in the early 900s if you're the cleverest person you've ever met and you want to have a stellar career as the cleverest person around? Where are you going to go? Where are you going to go? No, not Spain yet. Spain, you haven't really got that many peers in Spain. Babylonia. Babylonia is still the intellectual and cultural centre in the world. Massively. Spain is on the rise. The conditions for the golden age of Spain are about to be created. But this young man, who is? Of course, is Sa'adja ibn Yusuf al-Fayoumi, who we know as Sa'adja Gaon. And of course, as soon as he arrived in Surah, they made him the Aluf of Surah, which is like the deputy chancellor of the age of 25, and then he went on to be the Gaon of Surah. He wrote on just about every single issue to do with Jewish life. He is the Gaon par excellence. And when he had sorted out the calendar and sorted out the Karaites and sorted out all the many other cultural intellectual crises in the Jewish world, he turned 5% of his brain to looking at the Kalam, and he wrote an extremely important book called Emunot V'Deot. We don't have time, obviously, to go into that in detail, but I want to talk about one or two of Sa'adja's major contributions because they are so influential on subsequent Jewish philosophical thought. And here's the main one. Sa'adja argued, in attempting to synthesize or to at least to ameliorate Greek thought and Greek rational thinking with Jewish thought, the first thing you need to know is that reason, it's rational conclusions, reason and revelation must accord. They must accord. If I am told something, that does not mean I can reject it if I don't understand it, but if it conflicts with my reason, I can reject it. Sa'adja's famous example of that was the Jewish idea of reincarnation. It didn't make sense to him. He says, I don't have to believe it. There are people running around now saying, I have to believe in reincarnation. I don't have to believe it. His primary argument for that was because at the end of days, when we all wake up in the resurrection of the dead, who am I going to be married? But what it really, really applies to is the problem that was brought by the Kalam. Sa'adja says, if you want to tell me that the Torah is word for word literal, if you want to tell me it's literal, then you are telling me that God has a bodily form. We know philosophically and rationally that God cannot have corporeal form. Now, many people, even those in this audience, and I say this with full respect, might think that in fact the idea that God does not have corporeal form is something that has always been obvious to everybody in the Jewish world, but it hasn't. It hasn't even necessarily been believed by everybody in the Jewish world, even among sages. It doesn't compromise monotheism if you think God has a body. There are some rabbis of the Talmud that you might have asked and said, does God have a body? They might have said, yes, I've seen it. It might be a very big ethereal body, but it is a type of form. But Saadia wipes the floor with all of those views and establishes, pretty much for all time going forward, that Jewish rational thought requires us to understand that God does not have a corporeal form, and therefore any descriptions, any anthropomorphic descriptions of God must be allegorical. Therefore, allegory is an important part of the way we read the Torah. This is a huge shift in many ways in Jewish thought, and arises out of Jewish philosophy's attempt to provide the first-line defense against intellectual challenges coming from the outside. Saadia said many other things. What we can certainly understand from Saadia is that he establishes what are going to be some of the main subjects of Jewish thought going forward for the next few centuries, subjects such as the absolute paramount importance of free will. In the Middle Ages, they're already trying to understand free will and understand what it means. If God is omniscient and omnipotent, God knows everything that's going to happen. So what does it mean that we are agencies of free will? How do we resolve that? That actually doesn't get resolved for a long time, but Saadia outlines the problems. The other thing he outlines, which makes very, very clear that is not necessarily existing in Jewish thought prior to this, is, of course, the idea that the world was created from nothing. If you asked Philo, he might have been okay with the eternality of the world as coexistent with the eternality of the divine. To us, that doesn't seem to make sense, but for Philo, there was a total dualism between the divine and the earth, and the fact that God, in a way, created the world, and in fact, the way, or this particular earth, or the fact that God rules this earth, is not in conflict with the idea that substance is its own eternal thing, coterminous with God. But that gets completely rejected by the time we get to Saadia. And that we understand now, through lots of philosophical and rational arguments, that the world was created from the nothing. An idea, of course, that is consistent with, contemporary science as we understand it for very, very different reasons. However, I need to move on. So we've got Saadia, and Saadia really establishes the framework for what's going to unfold. But the philosophy of the Greeks that Saadia is reading is, for the most part, a big mishmash between Plato and Aristotle. Yes, Plato and Aristotle's teachings got carried forward into the New Age, but they were all mixed up. That job of sorting them out didn't really happen until the Renaissance. By the time, however, we get to the High Middle Ages, we are starting to understand more and more what belongs to Plato and what belongs to Aristotle, and Aristotelian thinking, and the idea of functionalism, the idea of logical cause, the idea of logical connections between things, of categorizing, of describing this universe based on human observation and the logical principles that drive that, which is all Aristotle, starts to come to the fore. And in order for us to understand the story of Jewish philosophy in the Middle Ages, we would need to understand this, that in the Middle Ages, and the height of the Middle Ages, the height of Aristotelianism, we're talking about the 12th and 13th centuries, Aristotle was science. It's very interesting. I wasn't going to say this, but I'll tell you this because it's kind of interesting. So forgive me. but because I just got back from the US last week, and that's what I made reference to the fact that I gave this talk a few weeks ago in a different way. But on that trip that I just took, I have a bit of a subterranean following in Williamsburg. There's a whole lot of Satmar Hasidim that bring me to these strange places in Williamsburg and ask me to talk to them. And they want to know all the naughty stuff, so they said to me, tell us about Spinoza. So I start telling them about Spinoza. And they go, oh, in order to explain Spinoza, I had to talk about the Enlightenment. In order to talk about the Enlightenment, I had to kind of contextualize the Enlightenment, so I went a little bit before the Enlightenment, and I talked about, I mean, these are guys in their, 30s, 40s. I had to talk about Copernicus. So who's Copernicus? So I explained Copernicus. And they looked at me and they went, the Earth goes around the sun. So I then had to explain the contemporary cosmological picture, and in the course of the next hour I had to bring them from the 14th century right up until the 21st. And I had to explain galaxies and the sun and planets go around, and those other stars, they're actually suns with planets going around them. And we talked about Kepler, we talked about Newton, we talked about this. It was very, very exciting watching them on that journey. Only on this Shavuot, 2 days ago, happened to be in Sydney and talking with someone in a particular shul, who then said and turned to me and said that in fact that is all nonsense, and that there was never a moon landing, no rockets have ever been into space, the Earth is actually concave, and the moon's only 4,000 miles. So when we talk about these things, we have to realize that everything is relative to a particular perspective. I'm not exaggerating. These things actually happened to me in the last few weeks. So I'm kind of thinking what message is being sent to me here. But Aristotle's picture of the universe was considered science, and it really, really was the best available picture that we had at the time. We might look at it now and it seems ridiculous, but it wasn't ridiculous in the Middle Ages. It was as real as us turning on and off the lights, which is science. Now, that created challenges for the particular Jewish cultures and generations that were living in the 12th and 13th centuries particularly, because they were coming under, in the Christian world, which is now starting to kind of recover itself intellectually, as well as the Islamic world, but particularly the Christian world. What are the implications of this for us if we base our understanding of the world and our purpose in the world and our continuum on a revealed Word of God? This is how it is. How do we account for these impressive intellectual achievements that are coming out of the non-Jewish philosophical world? What's the relationship? In fact, it kind of looks true. It kind of looks like that's much more of a valid and satisfying intellectual way of looking at the world. But can I really study philosophy and become immersed in that project and at the same time stay faithful to my traditions and my people and the revealed Word of God through the Torah in the world, which my parents and my grandparents and going all the way back have kept? How do those two work out? So we start to see the rise of attempts to synthesize Aristotelian thought with Judaism. And the first of those is not who you think. The first of those is Avraham ibn Daud, who we would hear a lot more about if it wasn't for the fact that he was about 25 years old when Paul was born. So if it wasn't for Paul, we would have heard about him a lot more. He wrote a book called Emunah Ramah, in which he argues that philosophy, as we understand it, is actually evolving. And it is evolving into Judaism. Judaism is in fact the most complete, revealed, rational knowledge, direct, mainlined to us from the divine. And all of human intellectual rational endeavor is simply moving towards that very, very clear picture. We just don't understand it yet. Ibn Dawood also has, and people haven't really, philosophers haven't really spoken about this. I'm writing something about it at the moment, but he has a very, very interesting discussion of the problem of free will that is now becoming quite acute in the Middle Ages. You know, we want to be able to say we have free will, but philosophically and rationally, if God is omniscient, then how does that even happen? And he argues that the concept of possibility or probability is actually built into the fabric of the universe. Now, he could not have been talking about what we talk about when we talk about quantum probability happening at the level of subatomic particles, but somehow, interestingly, through rational thought, trying to ameliorate those questions, comes to a very, very similar conclusion. But as interesting as Avraham ibn Dawood is, in the middle of the 12th century, his career is completely eclipsed by the big one. And the big one, of course, is Maimonides, otherwise known as the Rambam. Those who are confused about Rambam should know that it's Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, which is equals Maimonides. Now, it's not a lecture on Maimonides. We could talk for hours about the Rambam, but of course the Rambam, look, the Rambam was really, really impressive. I'm here to tell you, he was super impressive on a range of levels. If the dude had been living now, he'd have at least 3 Nobel Prizes. He was amazing. But at the end of the day, and he wrote the Mishnah Torah, this complete 20 years it took him to write a total compendium of the oral Torah, the first really one-stop reference, complete picture of, you know, halachic existence. And he was a doctor, he was a major physician. But at the end of the day, when everyone had gone home, the Rambam would go into his study, light a candle, and open Aristotle, because he loved philosophy. He was seriously turned on by the intellectual ideas emergent from philosophy, not just Aristotle, but especially some of the big Arab thinkers, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and some of the great Arab and Muslim thinkers that had worked with Aristotle to try and understand how Aristotle's scientific picture could be synthesized with Judaism. He did not believe that was for everyone. The Torah was for the masses, but for the enlightened cognoscenti, philosophy was really the way to go. And at the end of the day, as much as we admire the Rambam, and as impressive as he is, and the Rambam, I'm sure, will forgive me for saying this, but he was a bit of a snob. He really thought that the more that you advanced your intellect, and the more you studied rational thinking, really the more perfected you were as a human being. Now, all of this he lays out in his philosophical magnum opus, which is, of course, Moreh Nevuchim, which is known in English as Guide for the Perplexed. Probably the most towering book ever written in Jewish philosophy, immensely influential, but you should know, and I say this unequivocally, those who want to run home and get a copy of Moreh Nevuchim and open it up and look for all the answers should know that, as impressive as it is, the Rambam is really answering a set of challenges and questions that are coming from thinking that is not really still with us. Those questions that Aristotle is asking, or the Rambam's asking because of Aristotelian thought, is no longer really the way we are looking at the world, so you may not find the same level of intellectual satisfaction as those who did in the generations after the Rambam, who were looking for answers from the science of their day, and how that can fit into Judaism. What Maimonides is trying to do in The Guide for the Perplexed, as he's doing in all of his works, but here in a very, very open and revealed way, he is trying to re-establish Judaism completely as a rationalist project. Judaism is a completely rational set of ideas and practices. Mitzvot themselves, the commandments, are pathways to philosophical enlightenment. You might only get a certain way on the journey, but that is where you are headed. Your divine providence that devolves upon you depends upon your intellectual development and attainments. Prophecy is an outpouring of your active intellect into your imagination. Everything that happens is about you being a person of da'at, a person who knows, but who knows because they are able to achieve this rationally while staying extreme. Argues that as a first cause of everything that exists afterwards, non-existence is a quality that God does not have. That's why God exists. Because whatever we could say about the divine, we can only say in negative language. Because so Rambam takes our concept of God and goes, puts it right up there. Which of course is why, in a totally parallel development that I will talk about in a different week, the Kabbalistic idea, the Kabbalistic project of human thought, it is the Zohar, a century after the Rambam, that starts bringing God back down again. Because as a rationalist, Maimonides put God virtually out of our reach. All right, but what can you believe this? However, we'll make it, maybe. And then there's a shift. Actually, just before we get to the shift, we should talk about the last of the great Aristotelian thinkers, who comes kind of at the end of what we call the Aristotelian obsession period of Jewish philosophy, where all our challenges are coming from this. And that is the 13th century, 14th century figure of Rabbi Levi ben Gershon. I obviously don't have too much time to talk about him, but there's some very, very important contributions made by him. Who's heard of Levi ben Gershon? Very good. You know, he wasn't just someone who wrote a massive commentary on the Bible, and he wasn't just someone who made contributions as a philosopher. He was also the first person to develop trigonometric tables to 5 decimal places, which became very influential on subsequent navigation over the next couple of centuries. That is why there is a crater on the moon named after him, Rabbi Levi's crater. This is a very, very big figure that was also a Jewish philosopher. He was so concerned to preserve the notion of free will that his answer to the whole question of free will was to suspend God's omniscience. You're free because God doesn't know. He actually doesn't know what you're going to do. That's how much free will and free choice and free agency for human beings in this world is built into the fabric of this universe. A bit of a radical answer. He's the only one that says that. Now, however, at the end of the 14th century and the beginning of the 15th, there's a shift. And here is where we need to understand. And now I'm going to speak about this person for about 3 minutes, and then I'm going to have to spend 5 minutes on the next following 500 years, but that's okay. Because you know that things started going pretty awful in Spain about 100 years before the expulsion. That's when things started getting yucky. The massacres in Barcelona in the 1390s and so on. And as a result of, and not only that, but the massive disputations at Tortosa that happened in the beginning of the 1400s, these things decimated Spanish Jewry well before the expulsion. But one of the great luminaries of the Jewish world was a rabbi living in Spain in the early 1400s, late 1300s, 1390s, and early 1400s. And he effected a shift in Jewish thought that is influential till today. And it's amazing that more people don't know who he is, because he really, really, really changed things indelibly. And that is a figure called Hasdai Kreskas. Who said Hasdai Kreskas? Very good. As I always say, it's not something you put in a salad, it's what it sounds like, but in fact, that was his name, Hasdai Kreskas. And Kreskas was really, really upset with the Rambam. In a book called Or Hashem, The Light of God, he tried to completely revise the whole project of Aristotelian thought that had so influenced and affected Jewish philosophy throughout the Middle Ages. Really, I'm going to take as my yardstick for truth something that some Greek dude with a foreskin in the 4th century was running around telling me is the truth, is not going to be my standard. We're going to start from a completely different place. First of all, whatever we say about God, the answer is always total and yes. That famous question that you hear, can God make a rock that's so heavy he can't pick up? Whatever we say, whatever question begins with the words can God, the answer, yes. Yes. Omniscient, yes. Omnipotent, yes. Omnipotent, yes. The Rambam, all these guys, they're wrong. He's especially cross with Levi ben Gershon. I did it. God wouldn't know. What is it? Ridiculous. God is infinite. God is total. However, says Kreskas, the one thing that all these guys are not talking about, and which is extremely important for Jewish philosophers to talk about, and if you're not talking about this, you're not answering questions in the right way. And that is, what is the purpose of the world? What is its purpose? What is the purpose of humanity? Well, the Rambam tells you what the purpose of humanity is. The purpose of humanity is to achieve intellectual attainments and intellectual perfection. The Rambam doesn't really tell you what the purpose of the world is. And Kreskas says it's extremely important to talk about the purpose of the world, even if you get it wrong. Even if you're just speculating, the conversation on purpose is extremely vital. As it happens, says Kreskas, I know what it is, and I'll tell you. The purpose of the world is not about knowledge, it's about love. It's about love. God created the world out of love in order to have a relationship with other, and that we as created beings should reflect that love by having relations with each other and with the divine that are founded on love. That is a huge shift that happens. Kreskas's big student, Yosef Albor, who went on to make his... So I feel that I can tell you, there was this thing called the Enlightenment. Right? Now, what that means was, and we can all say, the Enlightenment, what do I care? But really, the Enlightenment shifted the paradigm for world intellectual culture, because at the end of the day, the Logos, the revealed Word of God, was in a sense replaced by the rise of mathematics and by the rise, following Cartesian thought. I mean, have you ever wondered why the world has suddenly changed so much in the last 500 years from what it was before? Is precisely because there has been a massive crisis and shift in thinking of the last 500 years. I'm not talking about whether that's good or bad and the whole idea of scientific progress, but it is a different way of looking at the world. By the end of the 17th century already, Newton's publishing Principia Mathematica, and we know how the planets are moving, and we understand this thing called gravity, and if we can start explaining those things, then really there's virtually nothing that human rationality cannot explain. And it is that engine that still drives us. We still feel that we can explain everything cosmologically, biologically, and in every single way. When we go home, we open the fridge and we turn on the light, we expect it to work. We don't say a prayer and I say, I hope the fridge is working. Or when we fly somewhere, we think, I hope the airplane stays in the air. Some of us do, but it's true, we do. But the reason we get on it is because we know that there is science behind it. The really next big shift, and like I said, I'm already at 9 o'clock, so I've got to do this unfortunately quickly, and this always happens to me in this particular talk. It's not really an hour, it's more like an hour. Ideally it would be an hour and a half, but it's going to be an hour and 5, 10 minutes because I can't not do this. But the big shift happens really after the Enlightenment, and actually even in the middle of the Enlightenment, in the middle of the 17th century, there is a young boy sitting up the back of the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, reading Guide for the Perplexed by the Rambam, reading Crescas, reading Albor, and deciding on a whole range and different way of looking at the world. We do not yet really regard Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, as a Jewish philosopher. It's very hard to fit into that system. Spinoza is not doing what Jewish philosophers do. He's not grounding himself on Judaism and what it means in the world and providing answers to challenges, intellectual challenges that are coming from outside that world. Spinoza is embracing that world and moving into it and has become a world philosopher. He's more like a philosopher who happens to be Jewish rather than a Jewish philosopher. Do you understand that distinction? No. Obviously, we could talk about Spinoza, we could talk about his concept of ethics, we could talk about his idea of pantheism, his very, very interesting idea of free will. But if we were to look at Spinoza through the lens of, say, Albo's criteria for what would make you a heretic, then yeah, he probably is. He doesn't believe in free will, he doesn't believe in miracles, he doesn't believe in supernatural intervention. He's completely deterministic in terms of what human beings are. There is God, but God is absolutely everything. For Spinoza, that's the only type of God that is possible to talk about, is a God that is absolutely everything. All substance, all nature, everything is God. We are part of God, we're inside God. And everything is determined. It's just the unfolding of the rational principles of what happens with God. We are God. It is God. God's everything. And so therefore you are no more free than a rock being thrown in a certain direction and thinking that's where it wants to go. We are simply products of rational causal principles that are unleashed. And that divine God is accessible in a number of different modes. We have thought, we have extension, but that's it. It's a huge, huge idea, and it's very, very influential on post-Enlightenment philosophy, but it's not really part of Jewish philosophy per se. The real shift that happens in the 18th century, because by now in the 18th century, we're moving into what we call, and you all learned at school, of course. Moses Mendelssohn. Now Mendelssohn was the biggest philosopher in Europe, in Germany. He was the greatest philosopher. He wasn't just a Jewish boy from the shtetl that said, he did well. He was the greatest philosopher in Germany. He claimed his fame because he won a famous essay competition, which asked to write an essay. It was an open competition in Germany, looking at the relationship between mathematics and philosophy and metaphysics. And he won that essay competition, and the runner-up was Kant. Yeah. So Mendelssohn became known as the German Socrates, and he was hugely great. He wrote this and he wrote that. He was a big age of, and not only that, he was a Jew. People couldn't believe it. This dude sitting there writing philosophical books, sitting in a salon playing chess. They go, how does a Jew do that? Remember that Mendelssohn himself was living in Berlin with a tolerance patent from the king. This was not that Jews didn't do that. Jews were like, in the shtetl. They weren't Mendelssohn. And people were coming to him and they were saying, you're Mendelssohn. We're all very impressed. But you live your life according to something written in the Old Testament, a book that's thousands of years old, given by a patriarch of God. That's how you live your life. And then you talk about the great age of reason ideas. What's happening here? Oh, and by the way, why haven't you become a Christian? So Mendelssohn, in order to answer a lot of these challenges, wrote a very famous book that I recommend you all read. A book that I still believe is incredibly influential on Jewish thought today. And that, of course, is his famous essay, Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, Mendelssohn argues that the Torah is not a book about metaphysical truths. It's not a book from which I'm going to get philosophical conclusions.